In this episode of Simply Offensive, I'm joined by my guest and friend, Cathy Ullman. Cathy works in digital forensics and incident response and has worked in cybersecurity for several years. She recently came out with a book on the topic of using red team knowledge and offensive security knowledge as a defender to be a better defender. In this book, she just describes how to leverage those skills to help you as a blue teamer. We discuss some of the older technologies and evolution of IT and cybersecurity. We discuss conferences in the community. I hope you enjoy this episode. Do zero-day exploits and supply chain attacks keep you up at night? Worry no more. You can harden your security with ThreatLocker. Imagine taking a proactive, deny by default approach to cybersecurity, blocking every action, process, and user unless specifically authorized by your team. ThreatLocker helps you do this and provide a full audit of every action allowed and blocked for risk management and compliance. Onboarding and operations are fully supported by their US-based support team. Stop the exploitation of trusted applications within your organization to keep you running efficiently and secure, protected from ransomware. Worldwide companies like JetBlue trust ThreatLocker to secure their data and keep their business operations flying high. To learn more about how ThreatLocker can mitigate unknown risks and ensure compliance for your organization, visit threatlocker.com/simply offensive. Hello and welcome to another episode of Simply Offensive. Today I'm joined by my friend Cathy Ullman. So Cathy and I know each other from the cybersecurity community, met online, and then past several years we get to see each other at conferences. This year is kind of nice because we're getting to see each other at more than one conference this year, which is always good. But I thought Cathy would be good to have on the show because Cathy works on the defensive side, but she's got a book that shares the need to understand the offensive side, even if you're a defender. She's got a lot of good stories, some great experiences. So welcome to the show, Cathy.
Thank you so much for having me, Phil. It's awesome to see you in this platform or in real life.
Yeah, same. I thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to do this. I know you're trying to get all ramped up for summer camp, and so it's good to have you on.
My pleasure.
So before we start out, if you wouldn't mind sharing with the audience kind of your background of what you do and kind of how you got started.
Yeah, sure. So I work for the University of Buffalo. I'm the principal technology architect for the security group, which doesn't mean a whole lot to most people. And essentially what it means is that I wear a lot of hats. So my primary specialty area is DFIR, and I do investigations both for our folks that manage students and for law enforcement, just depending on what's needed, sometimes employee relations, all these different entities. But I do other things too. I teach awareness and I manage the abuse queue, and I do a lot of different things here. And I got into this role in a very sideways way, like many of us did in my generation, in that there was no schooling for this. There was no, way to prepare per se. The security office at the University of Buffalo was started in 2006. And I had a friend who was starting to take some SANS classes on incident response. He was starting to teach me little bits and pieces, but we're talking about really early incident response. So I love you, worm, and the really early viruses, right? Like this predates when we first started doing it. It even predated things like NIMDA and Code Red. So he started to teach me some stuff, and that led me to an interest in forensics. The university decided that they wanted me to start doing some forensics for them. So I started working for the security office in 2007 and 8, and they pulled me in full time in 2009. But prior to that, I had been doing desktop and server support, came up through the sysadmin ranks like many of us did.
So very, very interesting how you got started. How has your career evolved? Have you stayed pretty much in the same area? You kind of evolved with the times and moved into different areas?
I've been in the security office. I've been the constant in this office. We've had a fair amount of turnover, both in terms of leadership and in terms of other folks working here. So in that sense, I'm in the same place, doing a lot of the same things. My job has just grown over the years to encompass more as they've needed it. And because I'm the person who has all that OG knowledge, sometimes my role expands to things like, we suddenly need to talk about AI, right? And the security office needs to be involved. Well, who knows the policies and the procedures and the things and the concerns security office has? Cathy has that information, so let's pull her into those committees. So I would say that, my actual place has not changed radically, but my experiences and my responsibilities have grown the longer I've been here.
So just kind of curious working in a university like that, because I know a lot of like hospitals and organizations that just don't have a ton of money to spend on security and stuff sometimes. How was that starting out? Was it a pretty small team when you were getting started out there?
Oh, yeah. So when I was brought into the team, there were three of us. So it was started with one individual who was the ISO, and he hired somebody to be the security manager to do a lot of the technical work. And then I was brought in because they decided they wanted a forensics for compliance program. So in other words, if we had a system that had what we consider category 1 data, which is like social security numbers, credit card numbers, that kind of thing, and the machine started behaving strangely, we needed to know if it's somebody who works with that data, were those numbers in fact on the system, and was whatever malware or whatever strangeness going on, did it with reasonable certainty, was there a likelihood that that data was exfiltrated or changed or touched in some way? And with the changes in security and the need to do away with social security numbers, we had not done that yet, but we were in the process of doing that. So that's really, when I was first brought on the team, that was the major focus. But there were just three of us, and at the time we had 2 campuses and roughly 10,000 employees, which we still about what we have now. And now we're at 3 campuses with about 40,000 people, still about 10,000 faculty staff, maybe a little more. So yeah, it's definitely evolved over time.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting when you mention things like Code Red and NIMDA. I remember fighting some of those back in my sysadmin days,
Sure.
and where we didn't have a lot of the automation and stuff back then, that you had to manually go from machine to machine or a remote desktop into those.
Yep.
And I remember the mortgage company I worked for, they brought in a bunch of contract desktop support people, gave them thumb drives or maybe CD-ROMs, CDs, and go around from workstation to workstation cleaning things up. With the way IT and security has evolved, because I feel like there's a lot more threats than what there were before. There's a lot more, but do you
Sure.
feel like our jobs are more difficult or easier now with all the automation and all these tools that have come through the evolution of security?
I would say in some ways they've stayed the same. The difficulties are just different. Certainly there's more out there than ever with the internet growing exponentially as it did. Obviously, we were going to see some changes, but I can't say that our jobs have gotten so much more difficult. I just think that it's just there are more tools to do things with, but also more things you have to look at. So it's kind of a balance, right? Ideally, the new tooling allows you to ignore some of the low-hanging fruit and focus on the other things because you have other folks maybe responding to that low-hanging fruit, but it just depends on the organization.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting how some of the tools and things were more difficult to use technology-wise and how it's got easier to use, but it seems like there's more threats.
Right.
Different environments are getting more complicated than what they used to be. There's so much more to it, because I remember my first security role, which I started in 2004, moving over from a sysadmin. I remember all the stuff we had in place. We had an intrusion detection system. We didn't use the intrusion prevention capabilities because we didn't want to shut down business.
Right.
And we had a firewall, and just the things that we had to do on the defender side, there wasn't, and we did some vulnerability scanning, but the tools we had were just not a lot. But
Right.
and
Very
then
rudimentary.
yes, but it's just interesting now that they got all these tools, but it seems like, we really need it because the threats are more. Because, I mean, you look at breaches and stuff, you didn't seem to hear about as many breaches back then. And maybe it was just because we weren't detecting it, but it just seems like there's so much more work to do now than what there once was.
Yeah, I think too, there's the sense that there's more data that's being protected and therefore more data that can be breached, right? So in the very early days, our hard drives were really small and even server space was at a premium. So there was only so much stuff that was being stored. And in a lot of ways, the cloud services have changed things because in the early days, if you had a pretty decent perimeter and you knew you could trust your people internally, you didn't have to worry too much about the outside world doing something to you except maybe via email. And now with the cloud resources that are out there, I'm always surprised when somebody says we have something like Entra, right? Microsoft Entra. And it just seems like attackers are figuring out what our user accounts are and they're going after all those accounts. And how do they know? And I'm like, because all you need is another tenant, any other tenant, and you can query any other tenant. It's actually very simple. And they're very surprised by this. And that's one of the major changes, right? Because we're using services like that, like cloud computing, it opens us up in a lot of ways such that we can't use a castle moat security direction anymore.
Yeah, it's interesting, some of the things you're mentioning here, because this brings me to your book, The Active Defender Immersion in the Offensive Security Mindset. What inspired this book?
So it's kind of funny. I wound up working with some folks to build a class here that was an independent study that was intended to be helpful to students who wanted to participate in CCDC, which is the Collegiate Cyber Defense Competition. And we'd had a student who attended at one point, and he didn't do very well because he really didn't know what to expect. And he came back as a graduate and said, hey, I think this would be a really cool thing for more people to do. How can we make this happen? So a bunch of folks were asked to come together from the industry and the university to sort of figure out what that might look like. And when I was at that meeting, I met an individual who worked in offensive security. And I'd never met anybody who did that. And in fact, I wasn't familiar with offensive security at the time at all. And I said, tell me more about this. Explain what offensive is. And so he starts to explain, and I'm fascinated by this. And I said, well, where do I get more information? And he said, go to a B-Sides. And I said, what's a B-Sides? And so he explained to me about the fact that B-Sides conferences are these, very approachable, small conferences that have a lot of technical content. And in particular, they tend to have a lot of offensive security content. And so I went to B-Sides Rochester, which interestingly enough, I now run. But that was my very first experience really with offensive security. And that experience really opened my eyes. I like to tell people who have seen the Matrix that, I fell down the rabbit hole, I took the red pill, and my eyes were open to these other half of security. Like most folks who do any kind of net admin work, right? We all know how to do things like firewall rules or IDS. We're very familiar with the basics, the fundamentals that we're taught in order to keep a system safe. But once we've done those fundamentals, we're done, right? Like unless we need to patch or there's a problem, we tend to not think a whole lot about it. And what I learned from being at that conference in that environment was that offensive security professionals look at our systems in a different way. So that's really how this got started. Was I started thinking about my offensive security colleagues and how they look at our systems. And I started thinking about the kinds of vulnerabilities and problems that we're seeing from the defense side and how machines are getting attacked, and realized, gee, there's a lot of information that defenders just don't know because they're not spending any time in this space. So that's really where the concept came from.
So from learning this, has this helped you in your role?
Substantially. So there are a bunch of different things that I understand a lot better now. We did our first engagement. It was a purple team engagement, and I was able to work very closely with the folks who were doing the attacks, and they would tell me exactly what they were doing, and we'd be looking for evidence of it in our logs and all these other things. But I understood when they would say the type of attack they were doing against us. It told me where to look in some cases for the logging. It told me what was missing when we didn't see something. It was incredibly instructive. And I've also found that, if I'm reading about a particular attack, it's much easier to know, for example, that something is probably not a big deal in our environment, because I have a much better feel now for the way an attacker would look at our systems and be thinking about a particular type of attack. And it's been incredibly instructive.
Yeah, that's good, and I'm glad that you're sharing that word, because it's just so helpful when you understand, the threat actor perspective, and some of the things people have been getting information on is kind of helpful is like cyber threat intelligence. So as far as your experience, do you use cyber threat intelligence much in your role?
So I do in bits and pieces. I pay attention to things like when DFIR Labs comes out with a new report, which, talks about a new attack they've seen. I make a point when I see these kinds of things to sort of scan through them and try to get a feel for what's novel, what might be relevant in my environment. And it begins to tell you more about when you see vulnerabilities, right? And somebody tells you, oh, this is, a critical vulnerability, but it's only a critical vulnerability in a certain context with perhaps a certain version of something, or where something's exposed to the internet, right? And on the one hand, you think, okay, we don't have this immediate threat because maybe we don't have the management console exposed to the internet. But at the same time, I take it a step further and I say, okay, it's not that we don't have to fix this. It's that this doesn't necessarily have to be a priority. We can kind of move that down the food chain, but maybe something else is a priority because we know we use that particular tool in the particular way that an attacker would go after it. It also lets me do things like, the example I love to use is something like Mimikatz. So we see defenders who've never heard of Mimikatz, which if you have not heard of it out there, it is a password stealing tool. And there are a gazillion ways that you can use this tool. One of them is mimikatz.exe type version, and that you might very easily see in your logs. But if you don't understand how attackers use these kinds of tools, you may not recognize when they are using other versions that are not called Mimikatz, but are serving the same function. So I have found it very instructive in terms of looking at logs and seeing intrusions and having a much better sense of what's going on and knowing when maybe we have a bigger problem than somebody might otherwise.
Yeah, I tell you that you mentioned purple teaming and then just the comments on Mimikatz. I'm a big fan of the purple teaming because it's just so much more you can improve your security posture when you do these purple team engagements, because otherwise you're doing a pen test, you're doing your vulnerability management programs, you're doing the remediation, and it takes a while to mature. And if you just rely on that and you're not doing things like purple team exercises, then you're missing an opportunity to help more rapidly, kind of mature your defensive controls.
Yeah, and I think it's really hard to try to do a purple team exercise that is useful if you don't understand anything about what they're doing, right? So they can show you the commands they're running and they can show you kind of how they're getting in. But if that's the first time you're seeing it, you're only going to learn so much, right? You're going to see it and you're going to say, wow, that's crazy. Whereas when we did it, pretty much all of the attacks, I was able to say, oh yeah, okay, I know what this is. I've seen this, or I've read about it, or I'm familiar with it, and I kind of have the gist of this. So I think it's difficult to do an effective purple team if it's just you seeing this for the first time and not understanding how they're thinking about doing the kinds of attacks, right? Because it's more than just hands-on keyboard typing things. It's understanding that thought process and the intent behind it, and you don't get any of that if you aren't looking for it and you're not asking for it. And you may have to ask for it, but does it even occur to you to ask, right? Like to say, so you did this kind of attack, like, what were you thinking? What was your thought process? And those are not the kinds of questions that purple team that you usually see in a purple team with a defense who knows nothing about offense.
So those exercises seem to help your team learn more about the offensive side?
Well, yeah, I think they were surprising somewhat to some of the members of my team. We still have a lot of things we need to implement because they're things beyond our office's direct control. But, one of the great things was, here's what we know does work. Right. So we definitely want to keep these practices in place. And at a time when money and time is of the essence, you might think, well, maybe we can get away with not doing something. And then you find out, oh, no, that's pivotal in what you do. And some of the things that we do that are particularly good for us defensively, in fact, don't cost a lot of money and are fairly easy to implement. So it's very interesting to find out what is working for you, not just what doesn't work for you. In our environment, we have central IT, and our central IT folks do some desktop support, but we have a distributed IT section that is other departments. So the College of Arts and Sciences has their own IT, the dental school has their own IT, the medical school has their own IT. And it's very difficult for central IT to say something like, you should do this without saying because we said so, right? One of the advantages of the purple team exercise is to be able to say, we recommend you do this because see, this is what happens when an attacker tries, and that's why this defense is valuable. I think it can be very helpful in terms of educating other members of the workforce to explain this is why we do this, not just because we said so.
So based on your experience, do you ever leverage things like MITRE ATT&CK?
So I don't find MITRE as useful as some other folks do. I mean, it's good for understanding if it's not attacks you're familiar with. It's good for understanding that. The problem is that I see MITRE ATT&CK being used as with heat maps. And the point of a heat map is to illustrate the fact that you have a detection in place for something. But the problem is that that detection is not necessarily detecting at a level that really gives you full protection. So there are tactics, techniques, and procedures, and most of our tools work at the technique level. So I'll just give you a very brief example. So for something like stealing credentials with LSAS, that is a tactic. A technique might be, more specifically what you're doing, to dump those credentials. But the procedure is going to be very, very specific. It's going to say, I use this particular application in this particular way. So if you have something like MITRE and you're using it to build things like heat maps, if you don't know anything about offensive security and you're relying on your tools, which aren't bad, don't get me wrong, but you don't understand what the limitations of those tools are because you don't understand that full ladder of what the offensive security professional can do, and likewise an attacker.
And for the listeners out there, comment into on the comment section and share if you've heard of purple teaming. Are you using purple teaming in your organization? Kind of back to that. I think that's a really good resource. So kind of what would you recommend for folks that on the defensive side to learn more about purple teaming, learning more how to leverage offensive security to help them be better defenders and better protect their environments?
So like my colleague told me, get to a B-Sides, get to offensive security conferences. B-Sides are all over the world. They're very accessible. They're usually very inexpensive, and go places where offensive security folks are. So, there are online spaces where they hang out. There certainly are in-person conferences. There are trainings. I recommend you don't need to suddenly magically change your role, right? You don't have to go from being a defender to being in offensive security, but it never hurts to take, a couple short classes just to see how do these attacks work? How are folks thinking about when they're doing this attacks, and spend time with the people who do this all the time. In some cases, they'll even teach you the novel things that they're learning themselves. What I have found in general is that the offensive security professionals that I know, and Phil, you included, is that, they're excited about what they do. Defenders tend to be very tired because we're kind of dealing with the same stuff day in and day out. And so it's tough to be around other defenders and hearing the same stories over and over again and expecting different results. But when you spend time around offensive security folks, they're often very excited about what they're doing, which does not mean that it's not equally as frustrating, because I'm sure, Phil, you've had to beat your head against a wall sometimes when you're doing a test of some kind, but somehow they stay curious and very interested and engaged with the subject matter. And so it's really a matter of finding more of those folks to spend time with, talk to, and whether it's an online platform or an in-person conference, that's really the best way to go about it.
So what are some of the other conferences that you like outside of the B-Sides conferences?
I go to a bunch of things. I really like GERCON, which is Grand Rapids, Michigan conference. I'm actually representing CypherCon. This is a CypherCon t-shirt from a couple of years ago. They're in Milwaukee, and typically end of March, beginning of April. And GER is in the fall, September, October timeframe. Those are fabulous. ThoughtCon, which is in Chicago, is very much an OffSec conference, and they sometimes have some really interesting bleeding edge things. And of course, DEF CON, where I am every year. DEF CON can be a little overwhelming. And I always, encourage folks, if you want to go to DEF CON, fantastic, but let's have a conversation if you've never been there so that I can help you make the most of your experience, because it's you and 26,000 of your friends, and that can be a lot.
Yeah, we're pretty fortunate to have such an amazing community within cybersecurity. For the listeners out there, if you're not involved, get involved. And if you don't mind commenting what conferences that you attend or planning to attend, that way kind of get a conversation started there. So what's some of your advice for folks that aren't really plugged into the community? How can they get started?
Like I said, I think getting plugged into the community is a matter of deciding, are you more comfortable with an online space? Are you more comfortable with an in-person space? Or do you like both? I mean, I know some folks are really hardcore introverts. It's very hard for them to go to an in-person event. But, one of the positives that I will say that kind of came away from COVID was that there are a number of online communities that have popped up, right? So Black Hills and Anti-Siphon have two great Discords where you can find folks from all over the place, both defense and offense alike. Those are great online spaces, and there's a number of those. If you do prefer an in-person conference, look to see what's in your area, and maybe use those online platforms if you can't find something in your area. Sometimes there are meetups. So we have something called InfoSec 716, which my friend Matt Gracie runs, who also runs B-Sides Buffalo. So I'll make a shout out to them. So there can be meetup spaces, maker spaces. There's also the DEF CON groups that are out there that are regional. So there's lots of different places to start. Just depends on what you are most comfortable.
And how can people find your book?
It is available at basically any bookseller you wish. If you are an Amazon sort of person, it is certainly available on Amazon. It is through Wylie Publishing, so you can order it. If you have an independent bookseller that you prefer, they can order it directly from Wylie. And Barnes & Noble carries it. It's pretty widely available.
And for the listeners, we'll share that book title in the show notes so you can find it more easily. So thanks for taking time out today, Cathy. It was great chatting with you.
My
And I
pleasure.
look forward to the next time we get to see each other in person.
Likewise.
Which is not too far off.
Nope.
And thanks everyone for joining. And make sure to subscribe to the podcast. Make sure to subscribe to the Simply Cyber YouTube channel and join the Discord. There's a really good community there, very supportive. That's one of the reasons I decided to start podcasting for Simply Cyber. So thanks everyone for joining, and we'll see you in the next episode. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Simply Offensive. I'd like to give a shout out and a big thank you to our sponsor, ThreatLocker. You can visit ThreatLocker at threatlocker.com/simply offensive.